In the quiet suburb of Sugarland, Texas, the Whitaker family seemed to have it all. Their home sat on a clean, tree-lined street. Neighbors described them as warm, kind, and family-oriented. Kent Whitaker, the father, was a businessman, disciplined yet gentle. His wife, Patricia, known to her friends as Tricia, was nurturing and deeply devoted to her family. Together they raised two sons, Kevin, the younger, bright and polite, and Thomas Bartlett, called Bart, the oldest, charming and intelligent. To anyone looking in from the outside, they were a picture of the American dream, close-knit, successful, and full of promise. By the time Bart reached his early 20s, the family's pride centered on him. He was their firstborn, the young man they believed would lead the next generation of Whitakers with integrity and purpose. He was attending Sam Houston State University, working toward a degree in business. Kent and Patricia supported him in every way they could, paying tuition, encouraging his ambitions, and looking forward to his graduation. When Bart announced he was about to finish college, they were overjoyed. On December 10, 2003, they planned a family dinner to celebrate his achievement. It would be a simple night out, a joyful meal, laughter, photos, and memories to mark the milestone. No one knew it would be the last meal they would ever share together as a family. The restaurant was cheerful, filled with the noise of other diners. Kent, Patricia, Kevin, and Bart enjoyed their meal and spoke about the future. After dinner, they returned home to their quiet subdivision in Sugarland. The drive took less than 20 minutes. As Kent pulled the car into the driveway, he remembers thinking how proud he was of both his sons. In that same moment, hidden inside the darkened house, another man waited with a loaded gun. What unfolded next would destroy the family's sense of safety forever. As Patricia stepped through the front door, she was shot almost instantly. Kevin followed close behind and was struck next. Kent was hit in the chest, the bullet tearing through his shoulder. In the chaos, Bart appeared to be injured as well, his arm grazed by a bullet. The shooter fled into the night. Within seconds, the Whitaker home had turned into a crime scene. 2 family members lay dead. 2 others were barely clinging to life. When police and paramedics arrived, they found Kent in shock and Bart appearing dazed, telling officers that a masked intruder had ambushed them. The story fit the initial evidence, a violent robbery gone wrong. There were shell casings on the floor and signs of forced entry near a window. The victims had been caught off guard, returning home from a celebratory night out. The community mourned with Kent, who had lost his wife and younger son in one night. Neighbors brought food and flowers. Reporters covered the tragedy as another senseless act of violence in an otherwise peaceful neighborhood. Kent underwent surgery and survived. He was left physically weakened and emotionally shattered. His wife of decades was gone, his younger son gone, and his eldest, Bart, had nearly been taken too, or so he thought. In the weeks following the shooting, detectives began to dig deeper into the details. Something about the crime didn't sit right. The supposed robbery yielded nothing of value. Jewelry was left untouched. Electronics remained in place, and there was no evidence that anyone had stolen anything. Even stranger, Bart's wounds were superficial compared to his father's. He had been grazed, but not seriously harmed. The lead detective began to suspect that the crime was not random. It appeared targeted. The investigation widened, tracing the family's movements in the days and weeks before the shooting. Phone records, bank statements, and interviews painted a more complex picture. Detectives learned that Bart had been under significant financial pressure. He had told his parents he was finishing college, but records from Sam Houston State showed that he had dropped out long before. For months, perhaps years, he had been lying to his family, pretending to attend classes, and fabricating grades to maintain the illusion of success. His graduation dinner had been based entirely on a lie. The truth about his double life began to unravel. As investigators pressed harder, they discovered that Bart had associated with a small circle of friends, two of whom would later become key figures in the case: Christopher Brashear and Steve Champagne. Bart's relationship with them went beyond casual friendship. Evidence showed that Bart had been planning his family's murder for months, if not years. He had approached Brashear, promising him money in exchange for carrying out the killings, and used Champagne as an intermediary to help organize the plan. The motive, prosecutors would later argue, was greed and control. Bart wanted to inherit the family's wealth and free himself from what he saw as his parents' expectations. To achieve that, he plotted their deaths. The discovery horrified everyone who knew the Whitakers. Kent, still recovering from his injuries, could not comprehend the idea that his son had orchestrated the attack that killed Patricia and Kevin. To him, Bart was the surviving victim, the son who had barely escaped. But as detectives closed in, the evidence became overwhelming. In early 2004, Bart's two accomplices began to talk. Steve Champagne, burdened by guilt, eventually confessed. He revealed the full plot in meticulous detail: the plan, the meetings, the payment offers, and the roles each person played. Brashear had been the triggerman, lying in wait inside the house while the Whitakers went to dinner. Bart had staged his own minor injury to appear innocent. The revelation was devastating. When an arrest warrant was issued for Bart, he fled. He vanished before police could find him. For more than a year, he lived under assumed names, first moving through the southern United States and eventually crossing the border into Mexico. While Kent Whitaker faced each day grieving the loss of his family, the man responsible, his own son, was hiding hundreds of miles away. Authorities worked with Mexican officials to track him down, but Bart proved resourceful. He found work in the tourist sector, blending in among travelers and using his charm to avoid suspicion. Still, guilt has a way of catching up. In 2005, a tip reached investigators. Bart was living under a false identity in Cerralvo, a small town in northern Mexico. Within weeks, he was arrested and extradited to Texas. When Bart returned to the United States, he faced charges of capital murder. Under Texas law, capital murder is the most serious offense, reserved for crimes involving multiple victims or the murder of a family member for financial gain. It carries only two possible sentences: life imprisonment without parole or death by lethal injection. For the Whitaker case, the prosecution sought the death penalty. The state argued that the murders were calculated, cruel, and driven by selfish motives. They emphasized Bart's leadership in planning the crime, recruiting others to kill his own family, and staging the scene to appear as a robbery. It was, they said, one of the coldest cases they had seen. The trial opened in 2007. The courtroom was filled with reporters and spectators drawn to the shocking nature of the crime. Kent Whitaker attended every session. For him, the trial was both unbearable and necessary. He wanted the truth, but he also wanted to understand why. On the witness stand, prosecutors laid out the timeline: the dinner, the setup, the shooting, the aftermath, and Bart's flight. They played taped confessions from Brashear and Champagne, who had already received plea deals in exchange for testimony. The evidence left little room for doubt. The defense team, facing insurmountable facts, focused on Bart's mental state. They described him as deeply troubled, narcissistic, and suffering from emotional detachment. Psychologists testified that Bart had lived a life of lies, trapped in a web of expectations he could no longer escape. Throughout the trial, Kent remained steadfast. He had already chosen forgiveness. In interviews before the verdict, he told reporters that he had forgiven Bart the moment he learned the truth. To outsiders, it seemed impossible, but Kent saw forgiveness not as forgetting, but as a refusal to let hatred destroy what remained of his family. His faith, rooted in years of belief and resilience, guided him through every hearing. While prosecutors sought death, Kent quietly hoped for mercy. When the jury returned its verdict, Bart was found guilty on all counts. The sentence, death by lethal injection. For many, the outcome was expected. For Kent, it was devastating. He had lost his wife and one son to murder, and now the state planned to take his remaining child. Over the years that followed, Kent began a mission unlike any other parent of a murder victim. He became an advocate for the very person who had caused his suffering. He wrote letters to the governor, spoke to the parole board, and met with faith leaders across the country. He told anyone who would listen that executing his son would not bring healing. It would only deepen the pain. His advocacy was not a denial of justice. It was a plea for mercy. Meanwhile, Bart lived on death row at the Polunsky unit in Livingston, Texas. Inmates there spend 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. Letters from Bart to his father revealed a slow transformation. Gone was the arrogance and deception of his youth. In its place was reflection, remorse, and a growing awareness of the magnitude of his actions. He began studying scripture, writing daily, and mentoring other inmates. In interviews, Kent described his son as a changed man. Whether that change was genuine or born of guilt, only Bart could know. But to Kent, it was proof that redemption, however late, was possible. As the years passed, appeals were filed and denied. The legal process in Texas moved steadily toward an execution date. Finally, in early 2018, the state scheduled Bart Whitaker execution for February 22nd. The news reignited public debate. Commentators revisited the case, weighing the legal arguments against the moral weight of Kent's forgiveness. Few could recall another instance in Texas where a murder victim's family, especially a surviving parent, had pleaded for the killer's life. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles rarely grants clemency. In fact, it is considered one of the most unforgiving boards in the nation, with near automatic approval of execution dates once appeals are exhausted. But Kent persisted. He met with officials, presented letters from community members, and delivered a personal statement describing why he believed his son should live. He told them that mercy was not weakness. It was strength. He explained that his faith demanded forgiveness, and that taking another life, his sons, would not honor the memory of Patricia or Kevin. His testimony moved even those accustomed to hearing pleas for clemency. In a rare and unprecedented decision, the board voted unanimously to recommend commutation of Bart's death sentence to life imprisonment without parole. The recommendation then went to Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who had the final say. In February of 2018, as the execution date approached, the final decision rested in the hands of Governor Greg Abbott. For Bart Whitaker, the clock was literally running out. In Huntsville, Texas, execution preparations are methodical and precise. The condemned inmate is moved to a holding cell near the death chamber. The atmosphere is quiet, clinical, and final. Bart had already chosen his last meal and written his final letters. He believed he had reached the end of his life. In Sugarland, Kent Whitaker sat in his home, praying for a miracle. For weeks, he had appealed to the governor's sense of humanity, asking him to spare Bart's life. He reminded the governor that the very people most affected by the crime, himself and the extended Whitaker family, had forgiven Bart. Kent was not asking for freedom for his son. He was asking for life, for the chance for redemption, to continue within the confines of a prison cell. The day of the execution arrived. Reporters gathered outside the prison walls. Crowds formed on both sides of the debate, some calling for justice, others for mercy. Inside, Bart waited in silence. He later said he felt an odd calm. The kind that comes when a person accepts the consequences of his actions. He did not expect clemency. Texas, after all, almost never grants it. The state has one of the highest execution rates in the country, and rarely does the governor intervene. Then, less than an hour before Bart was scheduled to die, the phone rang. The governor's office had made its decision. Governor Greg Abbott, citing the unanimous recommendation from the Board of Pardons and Paroles and the extraordinary forgiveness shown by the victim's father, commuted Bart Whitaker's sentence to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The execution was halted. Reporters outside the prison broke the news within minutes. Across Texas, and even across the country, people reacted with disbelief. For the first time in more than a decade, a Texas death sentence had been commuted in the final moments before execution. Governor Abbott's statement made it clear that the decision was exceptional. He acknowledged the severity of the crime and the pain it caused, but he also recognized the power of mercy. He wrote that Kent Whitaker's forgiveness had profoundly influenced his decision, showing a rare example of grace in modern justice. For Kent, who had spent 15 years living with both loss and hope, the call from the governor's office brought tears. He said later that it felt as though a great weight had been lifted, not because his son was spared punishment, but because mercy had been heard. Bart was returned to the Polunsky unit, where he would spend the rest of his life in custody. But this time, he wasn't the same man who had entered death row years earlier. He had been confronted with the reality of his crime, not just through the justice system, but through the unyielding forgiveness of his father. In interviews after the commutation, Kent said that his son's remorse was genuine. "He knows he doesn't deserve it," Kent explained, "but I think he's found peace in accepting what he's done and what's been given to him." And inside prison, Bart's routine remained structured and monotonous. Early wake-ups, walk assignments, limited recreation, and hours alone in his cell. Yet he used that isolation for reflection. Prison officials described him as compliant, introspective, and polite. He began reading theology and philosophy, often writing letters to people who reached out after hearing his story. Some of those letters expressed deep regret. Others spoke of faith and redemption. To those who asked how he could live with what he had done, Bart often replied that his father's forgiveness was both a gift and a burden, a reminder that mercy requires responsibility. The Whitaker case became a study in the intersection of justice and compassion. Legal scholars noted that the commutation did not change the facts of the crime. Bart had orchestrated the murder of his own family, and that truth would never fade. But it also demonstrated that even within one of the strictest systems of punishment in the United States, mercy could still play a role. The governor's decision did not erase the crime. It acknowledged something larger, that justice without humanity becomes hollow. For Kent Whitaker, the years after the commutation brought a different kind of challenge. He continued to live in the same community where the tragedy had unfolded. He spoke publicly about forgiveness, often explaining that it was not a momentary act, but a daily choice. He told audiences that forgiving Bart had not been easy. It was a struggle that required prayer, counseling, and persistence. But he believed that refusing to forgive would have imprisoned him in bitterness for the rest of his life. In interviews, he said, "I couldn't carry hate and grief together. One had to go." Over time, Kent's message began to resonate far beyond Texas. Churches invited him to speak about reconciliation and faith. Victim support groups asked him to share how he had found peace. Even families of other murder victims wrote to him, saying that his example helped them begin their own journeys toward healing. Kent always responded with humility. He never excused Bart's actions or minimized the pain they caused. Instead, he emphasized that forgiveness does not undo justice, it transforms it. Meanwhile, in prison, Bart began working quietly to mentor younger inmates. He helped organize Bible study groups, encouraged education, and shared his story with others facing long sentences. Guards described him as a model prisoner. Those who corresponded with him often remarked that his letters were measured and thoughtful, rarely self-pitying. He spoke often of accountability and gratitude, acknowledging that the life he lived now was one he did not deserve to have. The bond between father and son endured. Kent continued to visit Bart in prison, their meetings separated by thick glass and punctuated by brief phone conversations. He spoke about faith, about Patricia and Kevin, and about the possibility of spiritual restoration even within tragedy. Kent once said that he did not see Bart as the same person who had orchestrated the crime. He saw the man who had finally faced the truth and chosen repentance. Their relationship became an unlikely symbol of grace, one that challenged conventional notions of vengeance and punishment. The case drew attention from documentary filmmakers, journalists, and scholars studying capital punishment. They saw in it a unique paradox. A father who had every reason to demand death instead chose life, and a justice system that listened to compassion in a state known for its rigor. It forced difficult questions about what justice truly means. Is it the fulfillment of a legal sentence or the transformation of the human soul? Can mercy exist in a system built on retribution? For many, the Whitaker story offered a glimmer of hope. It showed that forgiveness is not the absence of justice, but its most profound expression. Kent never denied that Bart deserved to be punished. He simply believed that punishment should not erase the possibility of redemption. The law had done its part: arrest, trial, conviction, and sentence. But the human heart had added something the law could not: grace. As the years passed, public interest in the case waned, but the moral lesson remained. The Whitaker tragedy continued to be discussed in classrooms, churches, and seminars on restorative justice. Scholars pointed out that true justice balances two forces: accountability and mercy. Without accountability, justice loses structure. Without mercy, it loses soul. The Whitaker case stood as one of the rare moments when those forces met in equilibrium. Kent Whitaker later wrote a book about his experience titled Murder by Family, in which he detailed the events, the pain, and the path toward forgiveness. The book offered readers an intimate look at how a father could endure the unthinkable and still choose compassion. In one passage, Kent described standing outside the courthouse years after Bart's sentencing, watching families of other defendants weep as verdicts were read. He wrote, "In those faces, I saw what hatred does. It consumes everything. I didn't want that to be my story. I wanted my story to be about light breaking through the darkest night." His message carried across faith communities and even to those with no religious affiliation. The idea that forgiveness could coexist with justice inspired conversations about criminal reform and the value of empathy in punishment. Organizations advocating for restorative justice cited the Whitaker case as an example of healing within tragedy. For them, Kent's choice to forgive was a model for reconciliation that extended beyond crime. It spoke to the possibility of peace between people divided by violence. In interviews years later, Bart expressed continued remorse. He said that his father's forgiveness was the only reason he could endure life in prison. He called it undeserved grace, a living reminder of what he had taken and what he could never repay. "Every day I wake up, and I know my family should not have to deal with me being alive," he once wrote. "But because of my father, I have the chance to try to make something good out of what's left." In the broader picture of American justice, the Whitaker case remains exceptional. Texas has executed more people than any other state since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. Clemency in capital cases is almost non-existent. The fact that Bart Whitaker's life was spared because of his father's forgiveness made headlines precisely because it challenged expectations. It reminded the public that mercy is not a weakness of the system. It is a deliberate act of humanity that requires courage. As of today, Thomas Bart Whitaker continues to serve his sentence in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. He will never be eligible for parole. He will never walk free. But within the walls that confine him, he has found a measure of peace. His story, intertwined with his father's unyielding love, has become a testament to the power of redemption. The Whitaker tragedy began as a story of betrayal. It evolved into one of endurance, and it ended, if such stories ever truly end, with a lesson about the human capacity for forgiveness. Kent Whitaker's choice to forgive did not erase his pain, but it transformed it. Through that act, he reclaimed control over his life and his heart. He showed that love can outlast hatred, and that mercy can exist even in the face of unimaginable loss. The final legacy of this story lies not in court documents or legal records, but in the lives it continues to touch. It speaks to victims who cannot find closure, to families torn apart by violence, and to anyone who believes that despair has the last word. The Whitaker case proves that even in the harshest corners of justice, compassion can still rise. Justice was served. Punishment was carried out. But above all, forgiveness prevailed. In the end, Thomas Bart Whitaker's life was spared, not because the law demanded it, but because a father's heart refused to surrender to vengeance. That choice, the simple, profound act of mercy, became the most extraordinary form of justice of all.